Come with me before you freeze.
Frost coated the snare wire. Josiah knelt. He snapped the animal out of its misery with one bare hand, a rare mercy in this high country. Down in the settlement, folks starved. Up here on the ridge, living simply meant making ugly choices before the long winter made them first. Josiah wiped his hand on his canvas trousers, the coarse fabric stiff with dried mud and old blood. He did not look at the rabbit again. He just shoved it into the burlap sack hanging from his left shoulder. The morning air was sharp enough to split a dry log. He exhaled, his breath plumbing white against the slate-gray dawn, and stood. His knees cracked. He was 34, but the mountains aged a man in dog years. He moved through the timber with the quiet, deliberate pace of a man who measured his energy by the calorie. Snow sloved off the pine boughs, dusting his broad shoulders. The heavy Sharps rifle rested easy in his right hand, the walnut stock rubbed smooth by years of friction against his palm. He did not carry it for comfort. He carried it because the grizzlies were desperate this late in the season, and the wolves were getting bolder, tracing his trap lines and stealing his catch. By noon, he reached the timberline. Below him, the valley stretched out like a wrinkled gray blanket, scarred by the muddy rut of the settlement. Prospect Creek, it wasn't much of a town, just a collection of rough-hewn timber buildings clinging to the edge of a dying silver vein. From this height, the smoke rising from the tin chimneys looked fragile. Down there, people crowded together, breathing each other's air, dying of consumption and bad whiskey. Josiah preferred the clean, killing cold of the high country. Up here, if you died, it was your own fault. He began the descent. It took 2 hours to clear the steep shale and another hour to navigate the switchbacks down to the valley floor. The snow gave way to a freezing, ankle-deep slush as he entered the main thoroughfare. The town smelled of coal smoke, wet dog, and the sour tang of unwashed bodies. He pulled the brim of his slouch hat down lower, shielding his eyes from the biting wind that whipped between the narrow alleyways. Josiah made straight for Hiram's Mercantile. He didn't come to town for conversation. He came for salt, powder, lead, and coffee. The bell above the door rattled a weak, tinny sound as he pushed his way inside. The air in the Mercantile was stale, thick with the scent of raw leather, stale tobacco, and peppermint candy. Hiram, a stout man with a thinning hairline and a permanent scowl, was behind the counter, weighing out flour. Josiah dropped his stack of cured pelts onto the scarred wooden counter. The heavy thud drew the eyes of the 3 other men lingering by the potbelly stove. They stopped talking, sizing him up. Josiah didn't look at them. He kept his eyes on Hiram. 3 beaver, Josiah said, his voice grating like 2 stones rubbing together. It had been weeks since he'd spoken aloud. 4 fox, winter prime. Hiram ran a greasy thumb over the thick fur of the top pelt. Market's down, Josiah. Folks ain't buying luxury furs, they're buying beans, salt, powder, 50 pounds of flour. 10 of coffee, Josiah replied, ignoring the storekeeper's haggling tactic. He rested a calloused hand on the counter. The knuckles were white, thick with scar tissue. And a tin of peaches. Hiram sighed, knowing better than to push the mountain man. He turned to start filling the order. That was when the bell rattled again. The silence that fell over the room wasn't the wary quiet that had greeted Josiah. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, the kind of silence that precedes a hanging. Josiah turned his head a fraction of an inch. A woman stood in the doorway. She was small, wrapped in a threadbare wool coat that was 2 sizes too large, the hem caked in frozen mud. Her face was gaunt, the cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass, and her eyes were fixed firmly on the floorboards. Her hands were bare, the skin chapped raw and bleeding around the knuckles as she clutched a small woven basket. The men by the stove shifted. One of them spat deliberately into the spittoon. The sound was loud in the quiet room. "Store's closed for you, Abigail," Hiram said without turning around, his voice laced with casual cruelty. He kept scooping flour into a canvas sack for Josiah. She didn't leave. She took a step forward. Her boots left muddy water on the clean floorboards. "I have coin today, mister." "Hiram." Her voice was low, rough from disuse or cold, but it didn't tremble. "Don't care what you have," Hiram snapped, finally turning. He pointed a fat finger at the door. "I told you last month. I don't serve your kind in here. It's bad for business. Respectable folks don't want to buy bread from the same counter you lean on." Josiah watched her. She didn't plead. She didn't cry. Her jaw tightened, a small muscle ticking beneath the thin skin of her cheek. She reached into her pocket and placed 3 dull copper coins on an empty barrel near the door. "Half a loaf," she said to the floor. "Even the stale one." Hiram's face flushed. He grabbed a broom from behind the counter and stepped around to the front. "Get out before I have the sheriff run you out of town for vagrancy." He swung the broom, the bristles catching her basket and knocking it from her hands. It hit the floor, scattering a few measly roots she had likely spent the morning digging from the frozen earth. Abigail slowly knelt. She didn't look at Hiram. She didn't look at the men snickering by the stove. She picked up her roots, one by one, her bleeding fingers trembling slightly from the cold, not from fear. She picked up her 3 coins. She stood, turned, and walked out into the biting wind. Josiah watched the door close. He looked back at Hiram. The storekeeper was breathing heavily, attempting a smirk for the men by the stove. "Trash," Hiram muttered, walking back behind the counter. Whole family was rot. Good thing the fever took the rest of them. Josiah didn't ask questions. Gossip was cheap currency, and he didn't trade in it. He looked at his supplies forming a neat pile on the counter. He took out his leather pouch, paid the difference for the pelts, and began loading his pack. He hoisted the 50-pound sack of flour onto his left shoulder as if it weighed no more than a winter coat. He walked out of the mercantile, the tin bell rattling its pathetic farewell. The wind had picked up, driving icy sleet sideways through the streets. Josiah walked toward the livery to collect his mule. He kept his head down, trusting his boots to find the path through the frozen ruts. He found her in the alleyway beside the livery stable. She was sitting on an overturned bucket, trying to bind the sole of her left boot back to the leather upper with a piece of frayed twine. She had no gloves. Her fingers were stiff, fumbling clumsily with the knots. She was shivering, a deep bone-rattling tremor that she couldn't control. Josiah stopped. The mule, tied to a post a few yards away, snorted and stamped a hoof. Abigail froze, sensing his presence before she looked up. When she did, her eyes were wary, guarded like a trapped animal calculating the distance to the nearest exit. They were dark eyes, bruised with exhaustion. "You'll be dead by a hard freeze," Josiah said. It was a statement of fact, devoid of pity. "Not your concern," she replied, her voice raspy. She returned her attention to the boot, yanking the twine hard. It snapped. She stared at the broken ends in her hands, her shoulders slumping for just a fraction of a second before she straightened them again. Josiah lowered the sack of flour to the ground. He rested his hands on his belt. "I run trap lines up on the North Ridge, 30 miles of them. Takes me 3, sometimes 4 days to make a circuit. Cabin gets cold while I'm gone. Meat freezes solid. Takes half a day just to warm the place up when I get back." She didn't look up. "Congratulations." "I need a hand," Josiah continued, his tone flat. "Furs need scraping. Wood needs splitting. Fire needs tending. It ain't easy work." Abigail slowly raised her head. She looked at him, really looked at him this time. She took in his massive frame, the rough beard, the scarred knuckles, the cold, assessing look in his eyes. "I ain't a whore," she said. The words were blunt, jagged. "Didn't ask for one," Josiah said. "Asked for a worker. you keep the fire burning, you scrape the hides, you eat what I eat. Come spring, you walk away with $10 and a warm coat." She stared at him. The sleet was matting her hair to her forehead. "Why me?" "Plenty of men in town desperate for work." "Men ask too many questions," Josiah said, "and they drink the profits. You don't look like you have the energy for either." It was a harsh assessment, but true. She looked down at her broken boot. She looked at the frozen mud of the alley. If she stayed in Prospect Creek, she would freeze behind the livery, and the town would step over her body come morning. "When do we leave?" she asked. "Now." Josiah didn't offer her a hand up. He hoisted the flour back onto his shoulder and walked toward the mule. He didn't check to see if she was following. He heard the uneven drag of her broken boot in the slush behind him. The trek up the mountain was brutal. The storm that had been threatening all morning finally broke, dumping heavy, wet snow that clung to everything. Josiah led the mule, setting a relentless, mechanical pace. He broke the trail, his boots punching deep holes in the drifts. He listened for her behind him. He heard her ragged breathing. He heard her stumble, the dull thud of her knees hitting the frozen ground. He stopped, but he didn't turn around. He waited. 5 seconds. 10. Then he heard the rustle of wool as she dragged herself back to her feet. He started walking again. Survival wasn't about coddling. If she couldn't make the climb, she wouldn't survive the winter on the ridge. Better she died on the trail than freeze slowly in the cabin while he was out on the lines. The sky turned a bruised, violent purple as the sun dipped below the peaks. The temperature plummeted, turning the wet snow to dry, biting ice crystals that felt like sand against the skin. "How much further?" Her voice was a thin reed in the wind, barely audible over the crunch of boots. 2 miles. She didn't complain. She just put her head down and followed his tracks. By the time the cabin came into view, night had fully settled. The structure was small, built of thick, unpeeled pine logs packed tight with mud and horsehair chinking. It sat tucked against a granite overhang that shielded it from the worst of the northern winds. It wasn't a home. It was a fortress against the elements. Josiah pushed the heavy oak door open. The inside was as cold as the outside, but still devoid of the biting wind. It smelled of wood ash, cured leather, and old blood. He walked to the cast-iron stove in the center of the single room, striking a match and setting it to a pile of dry kindling he had prepared before leaving. The fire caught quickly, casting long, erratic shadows against the log walls. Abigail stood in the doorway, snow melting off her shoulders and pooling on the floorboards. She looked at the single bed in the corner, a mattress of pine boughs covered in thick bearskins. She looked at the small table, the single chair, the racks of drying herbs and stretching boards. "Close the door," Josiah said, not looking up as he fed larger pieces of wood into the stove. "You're letting the winter in." She closed it, sliding the heavy iron latch into place. She moved stiffly toward the stove, hovering her raw hands inches from the warming iron. She was trembling violently now that she had stopped moving. Josiah went to his pack. He pulled out a heavy wool blanket, rough and smelling of sheep, and tossed it toward her. It hit her shoulder. She caught it, wrapping it tightly around her frail shoulders. "Your space is there," he pointed to a corner near the stove, opposite his bed. "I'll fetch some pine boughs for a mattress tomorrow. Tonight, you sleep on the floor." She nodded once, a tight, jerky motion. She sank down into the corner, pulling her knees to her chest under the blanket. She didn't say thank you. Josiah didn't expect her to. He moved to the corner, poured a measure of coffee into a blackened tin pot, and set it on the stove. He took a knife and sliced thick strips of dried venison, handing 2 pieces to her. She took them, tearing into the tough meat, with a desperate animal hunger she tried hard to conceal. They ate in silence. The only sounds were the crackle of the wood in the stove and the wind howling against the granite overhang outside. The rhythm of the mountain was dictated by necessity, not time. Dawn meant fire. Morning meant labor. Dusk meant preparation for the next day. In the first 2 weeks, Abigail spoke less than 10 words a day. She moved around the small cabin like a ghost, making herself as small and unobtrusive as possible. But she worked. When Josiah returned from checking a short line of snares in the afternoons, the woodbox was full. The floors were swept clean of bark and ash. The water bucket was full. Getting water was not a simple chore. The creek was a 1/4 mile down a steep incline, frozen solid under a foot of snow. Josiah watched her one morning from the tree line as he returned from a hunt. He stood perfectly still, blending into the pines. Abigail stood over the creek, clutching a heavy, iron-headed mallet. She raised it above her head, the sleeves of her oversized coat sliding down to reveal thin, bruised forearms. She brought the mallet down hard against the ice. It bounced off with a dull thwack. She didn't pause. She raised it again, putting her back into it, striking the exact same spot. Again and again. It took her 12 strikes to crack the surface. She knelt in the snow, using bare hands to clear the jagged ice shards, plunging a tin bucket into the freezing, fast-moving water below. She hauled it up, the water sloshing over the side, instantly freezing against her skirt. She picked up the heavy bucket and began the steep climb back to the cabin. Her face was set in a mask of grim determination. Josiah stepped out of the tree line and walked past her. He didn't offer to carry the bucket. To take it from her would be to insult the effort she had just expended. He simply walked ahead, breaking a fresher, easier trail for her to follow back to the door. That evening, the tension in the cabin shifted, tightening like a damp bowstring left too close to the fire. Josiah was cleaning his rifle at the small table. He dismantled the action, wiping the metal down with a rag soaked in bear grease. The smell was pungent, earthy. Abigail was sitting in her corner by the stove, mending a tear in his spare wool shirt with a needle and thick thread. He reached across the table for a small punch tool. As he did, his elbow clipped a heavy tin mug sitting near the edge. The mug fell, clattering loudly against the wooden floorboards. Abigail flinched. It wasn't a small startle. Her entire body violently jerked backward, slamming into the log wall behind her. She dropped the shirt, her arms coming up instinctively to shield her face and head. Her breathing turned shallow, ragged, her eyes wide and unseeing, locked on a memory rather than the room. Josiah froze. He didn't move his hands. He didn't speak. He stayed perfectly still, assessing the reaction. He had seen green soldiers react the same to a loud crack of thunder after a heavy artillery bombardment. Then it was the physical reflex of a body that had learned to expect pain when a sudden movement occurred. He slowly looked down at her hands, which were pressed tight against her face. The sleeves of her coat had fallen back. In the dim light of the lantern, he saw it. Running up the inside of her left forearm, extending past the elbow, were thick, raised scars. They weren't from a blade. They were burn scars, deep, layered, and jagged, twisting the skin into pale, shiny ridges. They were old, but they told a clear, violent story, a brand. A hot iron held too long against struggling flesh. The whispers in the mercantile made a grim sort of sense now. A woman shunned not for what she had done, but for what had been done to her. In a town like Prospect Creek, a ruined woman was considered worse than a dead one. Superstition and cruel morality blended into a collective turning of the back. Abigail slowly realized the blow wasn't coming. She lowered her arms, her chest heaving. She saw Josiah looking at her arm. She yanked the sleeve down instantly, her face flushing with a sudden fierce anger. She glared at him, a defiant, cornered look. She dared him to ask. She dared him to pity her. Josiah picked up the tin mug. He set it quietly back on the table. He picked up his rag and resumed wiping down the bolt of the rifle. "Storm's blowing in from the north," he said, his voice level, gravelly. "Need to bring the rest of the firewood inside tomorrow. Stack it against the far wall. Helps insulate." Abigail stared at him, her breathing slowly returning to normal. He hadn't asked, he hadn't pressed. He had simply given her a task, an anchor back to the present reality. "I'll stack it before noon," she said softly, picking up the needle and shirt again. Josiah didn't say anything else. But the next morning, when he left for his trap lines, he didn't lean his heavy splitting axe against the chopping block outside, where he usually kept it. He brought it inside, leaning it against the wall right next to her bedroll. He didn't tell her why he put it there, and she didn't ask. Over the next month, the silence between them stopped feeling like a weapon and started feeling like a shared language. They learned each other's spaces. Josiah noticed that she always kept her back to the wall, so when he moved around the small cabin, he deliberately stepped heavily, ensuring she always knew exactly where he was. He never walked up behind her. She noticed that his left knee stiffened up when the barometric pressure dropped. On those evenings, without a word, she would boil a pot of water, wrap a hot damp cloth in a piece of oiled canvas, and leave it on the end of his bed before retiring to her corner. Late November brought the deep freeze, the kind of cold that shattered rocks and froze pine sap solid in the veins of the trees. Josiah had been gone for 3 days on the far northern line. He returned well after dark. He was coated in a thick shell of ice, his beard frozen to the collar of his coat. He kicked the door open, practically falling into the room. He dumped his pack on the floor, his hands too numb to work the buckles. The cabin was stiflingly warm. Abigail stood by the stove. She had a bowl of thick stew already poured, steam rising from the surface. Josiah stripped off his heavy coat, his hands trembling violently as the blood rushed back into his freezing extremities. He sat heavily in the single chair. Abigail stepped forward and placed the bowl on the table in front of him. She didn't retreat to her corner immediately. She stood there, watching his frozen hands struggle to grip the wooden spoon. Without a word, she reached out. Her warm, calloused fingers brushed against his knuckles. She gently pried the spoon from his stiff grip, scooped up a portion of stew and held it while he leaned forwards to eat. It was the first time they had touched. Her hands were small, roughened by the work she had done for him, but steady. Josiah looked up from the bowl. Their eyes met. The guard in her eyes had lowered just a fraction, revealing a quiet, profound exhaustion, and beneath it, a desperate need for the very thing she feared most, trust. He held her gaze. The silence stretched, heavy and fragile. Suddenly, a long, low howl shattered the quiet of the night, echoing off the granite cliffs outside. It was close, too close. The sound was immediately joined by 3 others, a chorus of starving timber wolves drawn by the scent of the blood in Josiah's pack. The moment broke. The harsh reality of the mountain snapped back into place. Josiah stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floorboards. He reached for the Sharp's rifle leaning against the wall, his hands suddenly finding their dexterity. Abigail stepped back, immediately grabbing the heavy iron fire poker from the stove. The wind howled, rattling the heavy oak door on its iron hinges, testing the strength of the barrier between the warmth inside and the killing cold waiting just beyond the timber. This story is not over, and neither is the winter. If you found some truth in these mountains, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It costs you nothing but means everything. Stories like this one are meant to be shared, passed around like a canteen by a warm fire. Join our community in the comments below. Tell us what you think Josiah should do next. We will be right here waiting to finish the tale with you soon. Wood splintered. The heavy oak door bowed inward under the sudden violent weight of a heavy body throwing itself against the timber. Dust sifted down from the ceiling joists. Another impact hit the door, followed by the frantic scratching of claws on thick wood. Outside, the wind screamed, carrying with it the guttural snarls of starving predators. Josiah didn't flinch. He broke the action of the Sharp's rifle, sliding a massive .50-70 brass cartridge into the breech. It seated with a heavy, satisfying metallic click. He snapped the action shut and thumbed back the hammer. The sound was deafening in the tight confines of the cabin. "They smell the meat," Josiah said, his voice flat. He didn't look at Abigail. His eyes were locked on the door hinges. "They smell the blood in the pack, and they smell the mule." A high-pitched, terrified bray echoed from the lean-to attached to the north wall of the cabin. The mule was kicking against the partition, panicked by the scent of the pack. "If they take the mule, we haul our own wood until spring," Josiah stated. He walked to the door. He turned to look at her. "When I step out, drop the bar. Do not lift it until you hear me speak your name. Do you understand?" Abigail stood by the stove. She still held the heavy iron fire poker. Her knuckles were white. She didn't nod. She just stared at him, her dark eyes reflecting the low light of the fire. "Do you understand?" repeated his tone, sharpening into a command. "Yes." Her voice was a dry rasp. Josiah gripped the heavy iron latch. He took a breath, letting the freezing air radiating from the wood fill his lungs. He threw the latch and kicked the door outward. The wind hit him like a physical blow, driving needles of ice into his face. The darkness was nearly absolute, save for the faint gray illumination of the snow, reflecting the sliver of moon above the storm. 3 shapes moved in the swirling white. They were massive, gaunt, desperate gray timber wolves driven down from the higher elevations by the killing freeze. The closest one lunged the moment the door opened, a blur of matted fur and snapping teeth. Josiah didn't aim. He leveled the heavy barrel and pulled the trigger. The Sharps roared, a blinding flash of yellow fire illuminating the blizzard. The heavy slug caught the wolf mid-air, tearing through its chest with a wet, sickening thud. The animal slammed into the snowbank, dead before it stopped sliding. Josiah dropped the empty rifle. There was no time to reload a single-shot breechloader. He drew the heavy bone-handled hunting knife from his belt, just as the second wolf hit him. 70 pounds of starving muscle slammed into his chest, knocking him backward against the doorframe. Jaws snapped inches from his throat, the animal's foul breath hot against his skin. Josiah brought his left forearm up, jamming the thick wool of his coat into the wolf's mouth. Teeth sank through the fabric, piercing the muscle of his forearm. Pain flared, sharp and blinding. Josiah grunted, planting his boots firmly on the icy threshold. He drove the knife upward in a brutal, arcing thrust, burying the 7-inch blade behind the wolf's ribs. He twisted the handle, feeling the hot rush of blood over his hand, and shoved the dying animal off him. He was breathing hard, the cold air burning his lungs. Blood ran down his left arm, steaming in the frigid air. He looked up. The third wolf was hesitating near the lean-to, its yellow eyes reflecting the faint light from the open doorway. It looked at the 2 dead members of its pack, then at the massive man standing in the threshold. It bared its teeth in a final, silent snarl, turned, and vanished into the blowing snow. Josiah stood in the doorway for a long moment, his chest heaving. He listened to the wind. Nothing else moved. He turned around. Abigail was standing 2 feet behind him. The heavy iron poker was raised above her head, her stance wide, her eyes locked on the darkness outside. She hadn't dropped the bar. She hadn't stayed inside. She had stepped into the threshold, ready to swing the iron into bone. Josiah looked at her. He looked at the raised iron. "I told you to drop the bar," he said, his voice tight with pain. "I didn't hear the door close," Abigail replied simply. She didn't lower the poker until he stepped fully back into the cabin and dragged the heavy door shut behind him. She immediately dropped the iron bar into the iron brackets, securing the heavy wood. Josiah leaned against the wall, sliding down until he hit the floor. He dropped the bloody knife onto the floorboards. He gripped his left forearm. The heavy wool was soaked, a dark, spreading stain that looked black in the dim light. Abigail moved immediately. She didn't panic. She didn't ask if he was all right. The mountain had already stripped away the luxury of useless questions. She walked to the stove, grabbing the tin kettle and moving it directly over the hottest part of the iron. She went to her corner, tearing a long, clean strip of cotton from the hem of her only spare shift. She moved to the table, retrieving his small leather kit that held a needle, heavy linen thread, and a bottle of cheap, raw whiskey he used for cleaning traps. She knelt beside him on the floor. "Let me see," she demanded. Josiah unbuttoned the cuff of his coat with his good hand. He tried to pull the sleeve up, but the wool was already freezing to the torn flesh. He grimaced. Abigail took his wrist. Her hands were surprisingly strong. "Hold still." She took his hunting knife from the floor, wiped the blade on her skirt, and carefully slipped it under the heavy wool sleeve. With a sharp upward motion, she sliced the sleeve open to the elbow. She peeled the fabric back. The bite was deep. 4 puncture wounds tearing through the muscle, bleeding sluggishly but heavily. She uncorked the whiskey bottle with her teeth, spitting the cork onto the floor. "Bite down on your collar," she instructed. Josiah clamped his jaw. He didn't bite the wool. He stared at the ceiling logs. Abigail poured the raw alcohol directly into the open wounds. Josiah's entire body went rigid. A low, ragged groan escaped his gritted teeth. His right hand balled into a fist, the knuckles popping in the quiet room. Abigail didn't apologize. She set the bottle down, threaded the needle with rapid, practiced movements, and leaned over his arm. 3 stitches on the top. 2 on the bottom, she murmured, more to herself than to him. She pierced the skin. Josiah watched her face. It was completely focused. The defensive, hunted look was gone, replaced by a cold, clinical efficiency. Her hands didn't shake. She pulled the thick thread tight, closing the torn flesh. "You've done this before," Josiah observed, his voice strained. "Stitched up a lot of things," she replied, not looking up. She tied off the first knot and moved to the next puncture. "Who did the brand?" he asked. The needle stopped, just for a fraction of a second. Then it pushed through the skin again. "Man named Hatcher," she said. Her voice was devoid of emotion, flat, factual. "Ran a freight company down in the Silver Bow territory. My father owed him money. Father died of the lung rot. Debt transferred to the only property left." She tied off the second knot. "I worked his ledger books, cooked for his drivers, lived in a shed behind the stables. One night I found out he was skimming off the miners' wages, blaming it on lost freight. He caught me locking at the real numbers." She moved to the underside of his arm. "He told me I belonged to him. Said if I breathed a word, he'd sell me to a parlor house in San Francisco. Said he'd mark me so they knew I was stolen property if I tried to run." She tied the final knot, biting the thick thread to snap it. She took the clean cotton strip and wrapped it tightly around his forearm, applying pressure to stop the lingering bleeding. "So I waited until he was asleep." Abigail finished, tying the bandage. "I took his real ledgers, and I threw them in the stove." Josiah looked at her. "He woke up." "He woke up," she confirmed, sitting back on her heels. "He pulled the iron poker out of that stove, pressed it into my arm until the skin gave way. Told me to leave the camp and never stop walking, or he'd finish the job." She looked up, meeting his eyes. "I've been walking for 2 years. Prospect Creek was just where the money ran out." Josiah stared at the tight, neat bandage on his arm. He looked back at her face. The firelight caught the sharp angles of her jaw, the dark circles under her eyes. She wasn't a broken thing. She was a survivor, forged in a different kind of fire. "Hatcher," Josiah repeated the name, filing it away in the cold, dark corners of his mind. "He's a long way from here," Abigail said, misreading his silence. "He doesn't know where I am." "Doesn't matter," Josiah said, struggling to his feet. He swayed slightly, leaning against the wall. "If he ever comes up this ridge, he feeds the pines." It wasn't a comfort. It was a statement of geographical fact. Abigail looked at the massive man, bleeding in his ruined coat, offering her the genuine perimeter of safety she had known in 2 years. She picked up the whiskey bottle, the needle, and the bloody rags. "Sit by the stove," she ordered quietly. "I'll make tea." The winter did not break easily. It surrendered inch by stubborn inch. By late April, the killing freezes gave way to cold, biting rains. The snowpack on the ridge began to rot, turning the mountain into a treacherous landscape of mud and hidden ice flows. The creek swelled, roaring down the canyon with deafening force, carrying whole pine trees in its churning brown water. Inside the cabin, the heavy silence of the early months had melted away, replaced by the quiet hum of routine. They moved around each other with a practiced, unconscious grace. When Josiah cleaned his rifles, Abigail moved the lantern closer to his side of the table without being asked. When Abigail knelt to scrub the ash from the stove, Josiah stepped over her without breaking his stride or disturbing her work. His arm healed clean. It left an ugly, puckered scar, but the muscle remained strong. He had lost 3 days of trapping to the fever that followed the wolf bite, during which Abigail had kept the fire roaring and forced willow bark tea down his throat every 2 hours. She had not slept until his fever broke. He knew this, though neither of them ever spoke of it. On the morning of the first true spring day, the sky broke open, revealing a startling, bruised blue. The air smelled of wet earth and pine needles. Josiah stood by the door, lacing up a lighter pair of leather boots. He walked to the small shelf above his bunk, reaching behind a stack of loose pistol cartridges. He pulled down a dented tin tobacco box. He walked to the center table. Abigail was there, kneading a small mound of dough for the morning bread. Her hands were stronger now, the cuts and chapping healed, her forearms corded with lean muscle. Josiah set the tin box on the table. It made a sharp clatter against the wood. Abigail stopped kneading. She looked at the box. Josiah opened it. Inside were 10 silver-dollar coins and a heavy, oiled canvas coat he had traded for in a settlement to the north 3 years ago. It was too small for him, but it was lined with thick sheep's wool. It was completely waterproof. "Snow's gone from the pass," Josiah said, his voice carrying that familiar, gravelly weight. "Trail down to Prospect Creek is mud, but it's passable. Wagon trains will start moving through the valley next week, heading toward Oregon." Abigail stared at the silver coins. She didn't touch them, wiped her flour-covered hands on her apron. "The bargain was for the winter," Josiah continued. He didn't look at her face. He looked at his boots. $10, a coat. You kept the fire burning. You earned it." The words hung in the air, thick and awkward. It was exactly what he had promised in the alleyway behind the livery. A transaction. Survival traded for labor. Abigail looked at the man standing before her. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight slightly on his bad knee. He was offering her an exit. He was giving her exactly what she needed to leave, to find a place where no one knew her name or the scars on her arm. Before she could speak, the mule brayed sharply outside. Josiah's head snapped up. It wasn't the hungry cry of winter. It was an alarm. He reached across the table, grabbing the Colt revolver resting near his plate, and moved to the window. He peered through the thick, warped glass. A rider was coming up the trail. The horse was lathered in sweat, its chest heaving as it navigated the steep, muddy switchbacks. The man in the saddle wore a long canvas duster and a flat-brimmed hat. He sat heavy, riding like a man who spent more time on horseback than on his own 2 feet. "Someone's coming," Josiah muttered, thumbing the hammer of the Colt back. Abigail stepped away from the table, moving instinctively toward the shadows in the corner. Her hand drifted to the fabric over her left arm. Josiah opened the door before the rider reached the clearing. He stepped out onto the muddy porch, the revolver hanging loosely at his side, clearly visible. The rider pulled back on the reins, halting his horse 10 yards from the cabin. He looked down at the mud, then up at the mountain man. The rider had a sharp, predatory face, his jaw stained with tobacco juice. "Long ride up here," the man called out, resting a hand on the pommel of his saddle, inches from a holstered pistol. "Trail's closed," Josiah said. The rider spat into the mud. "Name's Corliss. I ain't looking for a trail. Looking for a woman. Small thing, dark hair. Goes by Abigail." Josiah didn't blink. He didn't shift his stance. "No one by that name here." Corliss smirked, pulling a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket. "Got a paper here from a Mr. Hatcher down in Silver Bow. Says this woman stole property. Valuable ledgers. He's offering $50 for her return. Alive, preferably. But he ain't picky." Corliss leaned forward in the saddle. "Now, folks down in Prospect Creek said, a mountain man fitting your ugly description dragged a stray up this ridge before the first snow. I'm thinking you might want to share that $50, friend. Or I can take her, and you can keep tending your traps." Josiah slowly raised his right arm, leveling the heavy Colt directly at the center of Corliss's chest. "You got a 3-second head start to turn that animal around," Josiah said, his voice dropping an octave, resonating with a terrifying absolute calm. "Before I put a hole in you big enough to whistle through." Corliss's smirk vanished. His hand twitched toward his holster. The metallic clack-clack of a heavy rifle hammer cocking froze the tracker's hand instantly. Corliss looked past Josiah. Abigail was standing in the doorway. She held the massive Sharps rifle, the heavy barrel resting perfectly level against her shoulder. Her eye was aligned with the rear sight. The muzzle was pointed squarely at the bridge of Corliss's nose. She wasn't hiding in the corner. She wasn't shrinking away. Her hands did not shake. "I prefer he doesn't get a head start, Josiah," Abigail said, her voice ringing out clear and cold across the clearing. Corliss swallowed hard. He looked at the massive man with the revolver and the woman holding a buffalo rifle that could tear a horse in half. He calculated the math of the situation and realized he was already dead if he moved a muscle. Slowly, carefully, Corliss raised both hands, grasping the reins high up. "No need for noise," Corliss said, his voice tight. He backed his horse up a few paces, the animal slipping slightly in the mud. "Just doing a job, ain't worth dying over. Tell Hatcher," Abigail called out, her grip tightening on the stock. "Tell him if he ever sends another man, or comes himself, he won't find a terrified girl. He'll find me." Corliss didn't reply. He turned the horse sharply and spurred it back down the muddy trail, riding reckless and fast toward the valley. They watched him go until the timber swallowed the rider whole. Josiah slowly lowered the revolver. He uncocked the hammer and slid it into his belt. He turned to look at Abigail. She was still holding the heavy rifle, her breathing slightly accelerated, but her jaw was set like granite. He walked back up the 2 wooden steps onto the porch. He reached out and gently pushed the heavy barrel of the Sharps toward the floorboards. She let him take the weight of it. They stood there on the porch, the spring wind catching the loose strands of her dark hair. Josiah looked at the open door, then back to the woman. $10, Josiah said quietly. "And a coat." Abigail looked him in the eye. The guard was completely gone. In its place was a quiet, unshakable foundation. She turned, walking back into the cabin. She went to the table, picking up the heavy canvas coat. She folded it neatly and placed it at the foot of his bed. She picked up the 10 silver dollars, put them back in the tin box, and closed the lid with a firm snap. She walked back to the table and plunged her hands back into the flour-dusted dough. "Keep the money in the tin," Abigail said, not looking back at the door. "I'm going to need to buy seed when the ground thaws. We need a garden if we're going to winter here again." Josiah stood on the porch. The tension that had lived in his shoulders for 34 years finally began to release. A rare, quiet warmth settled into the scarred hollows of his chest. He stepped inside, closed the heavy oak door, and slid the iron latch into place. "I'll clear the brush on the south slope tomorrow," he said, moving to the stove to pour a cup of coffee. "Soil's good there. Make sure you dig deep," she replied, the faintest trace of a smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. "I don't want the frost killing the roots." The thaw had finally come to the mountain. If you felt the cold of the ridge and the warmth of the fire, leave a like and subscribe. It costs nothing but keeps the stories burning. Tell us down below, what seeds should they plant on that south slope? Join the camp, share the tale, and we'll see you back here for the next one.